All right, well, good morning, everyone. I'm Jessica Hellman, and thank you for that recognition of the Institute on the Environment. You sit here right now in the Institute on the Environment, and we're just thrilled to have you. I am particularly thrilled to participate in this symposium because I'm new to the state of Minnesota. I've been here a little over a year, but I am not new to skippers and to Lepidoptera in general. And I have been studying species of skipper, the Propertius duskywing in western North America for more than a decade. And I also work on a variety of swallowtails and endangered species like the Carner blue butterfly. We've done a bunch of experimentation on, which shows a trajectory in places through its range that actually looks quite similar to the one that we just saw here. So I'm very, very excited to be indoctrinated into the ecology and biology of these very important species and ecosystems. So I'm grateful to have the opportunity to do the moderation, to moderate these sessions today. So I understand that each of our speakers has a 20-minute slot, but actually 15 minutes to talk. So I'm going to try to be pretty aggressive. And the way to be aggressive if you sit in the front row is just simply to stand up like this. So I'll do that. I'll give a little wave with a few moments to spare and then stand up when 15 minutes are over. Sound good? Eric, sound good to you? Okay. So our first presentation in the first session, so we'll have, 4 talks and then a break. The first series of talks will be talking about both skippers and aphids, and then later we'll talk about risk assessment. And then we'll have lunch at noon this afternoon. So our first presentation is by Phil, make sure I say this, Delphy, from the Fish and Wildlife Service in Bloomington. Status, now see, you guys need to help me because, how do I say this correctly? I should have said, Phil, help me. Poweshiek. Poweshiek skipperling and other prairie butterflies, including discussion of possible causes of the declines.
So the title only addresses Poweshiek skipperling and other butterflies. I'll primarily talk about these two species, Dakota skipper and Poweshiek skipperling. Let's see, make sure I'm oriented here. So Dakota skipper, and I promised Robert I wouldn't say anything about their biology because that's going to be the focus of his talk, but it's hard not to say just a little bit. So this is a male taken on a prairie lily up in central North Dakota and a female from the Minnesota Zoo. And I'll gloss over these really quick and just get to kind of the range-wide status of the species. A caterpillar emerging from the egg at the zoo, and then you can see the caterpillar. And I'm sure Robert will talk about this, but this species, just to draw a little bit of a distinction, Dakota skipper, and I hope this is credited to Minnesota Zoo. I can't see the credit, but a Dakota skipper caterpillar in the shelter at a base of a grass plant. And so I came to Minnesota in 2000, and before I got here, Robert had been working on Dakota skipper for years in Minnesota. And it became clear, this is one of the first issues I dealt with when I came to Minnesota, was the question as to whether or not we should list Dakota skipper as threatened or endangered. And so in 2002, a woman who used to work for the service, Jean Cochran, and myself, we took a hard look at the species and decided that it warranted, the information that we had on the species justified proposing it as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And at that time, it became what we call a candidate for listing. That was 2002. And so really, during the 2000s, we built up this database of surveys that were conducted. And to conduct a survey for Dakota skipper, you have to have a fair amount of expertise in identifying the skipper and its habitat. You have to go out at the right time of the year because they only fly for maybe 2 weeks or so in late June, early mid-July. And you have to conduct the survey under appropriate conditions because if it gets too cloudy or a little bit rainy, they're not going to fly. And so we looked at all the surveys that were conducted kind of throughout this region. And over the last 10 years or so, we put together this database of surveys. And so all these points are areas where, and there's many overlapping points, but you can see where the surveys really that are valid for this species have been conducted over the years. And then we jump down to where those surveys actually turned up a Dakota skipper. And so you can see, as far as we know, and this cuts off a few records, or just really one record that's a museum specimen from Oak Park, Illinois, believe it or not. But really, this is where the vast majority of the positive records for Dakota skippers are, down into Iowa, and then up through the Prairie Coteau. And remember, these surveys were all pretty much conducted after the vast majority of prairie destruction occurred. So by the time there were many surveys for this species, the vast majority of the prairie in Iowa was gone. A lot of the prairie in Minnesota was gone. And so we know that there were probably a lot of populations not shown here that were never recorded. And then recently, we've gone through these records and looked at what we know about the habitat conditions, or where we've had follow-up surveys that we usually say if we go back to these sites and you conduct valid surveys for 3 years and they're all negative, we don't think the species is there anymore. Or where the habitat's clearly been destroyed or modified. And we recently have kind of grouped these into what we call metapopulations. So these are areas where we think there might still be extant metapopulations of the Dakota skipper. So groupings of kind of local populations that probably interact to some degree by dispersal. And you can see the one dramatic thing for Minnesota is that we may have wound up now with really only one remaining metapopulation. And just to go back so you can see, in Minnesota there were several population strongholds, like some large prairie preserves in southwest Minnesota. Glacial Lake State Park is a really large complex of prairies. Extreme southern Manitoba, where the Nature Conservancy of Canada has a large preserve. And those are all gone, and we've wound up with really just one, like I said, just one metapopulation that we feel good about in Minnesota, I think. And so just to give you a brief review of what kind of habitat the species uses, this shows a kind of a blurry picture of the nature of the habitat, but I wanted you to see that there's kind of, in a way, two distinct habitat types for the Dakota skipper. There's this relatively flat mezack prairie that you see in Manitoba, and this is a close-up. A lot of these prairies are hayed where Dakota skipper occurs, these flat, relatively mezack sites. Almost all of them are managed with haying. A lot of times that haying, almost always it's conducted, or always is conducted after the Dakota skipper flight period. And so they'll come in and hay this, maybe even every other year. And it has some effects on the vegetation that haying. It may drive the plant community in a certain direction, but it seems to maintain pretty good habitat conditions for Dakota skipper. And remember, they're down, buried as larvae in the base of these grasses. So that haying going over, really the hay is being collected right over the top of those skippers. Let's see. And so one of the predominant nectar species in this habitat type is black-eyed Susan. This is Ron Royer recently retired from Minot State University for scale, out sitting in one of this kind of habitat in north-central North Dakota. Then there's this dry mezack prairie that a lot of times is on these hillsides or hilltops, like at Hole in the Mountain Prairie in Minnesota, Glacial Lake State Park, the Prairie Coteau of eastern South Dakota, but also reaching out into western North Dakota, where you see this drier prairie top kind of on ridge tops above the Missouri River. And this is the one site in Minnesota, where we still think we have Dakota skippers, the Felton Prairie area. And this shows the habitat type. This is a tribal site owned on the Lake Traverse Reservation in east central South Dakota. This is a dry mezack site that's hayed after the needle grasses have shed. So the needle grasses shed their seed, and they don't hay these areas until that needle grass seed has dropped, because those are really sharp, pointy seeds, and they don't want that in the hay. But this results in gives you a really great proliferation of the predominant nectar species in this habitat type for Dakota skipper, which is purple coneflower. So now I'll jump to Poweshiek. Poweshiek overlapped quite a bit, and I'll show you the map, but they have a very different larval stage, and I'll let Robert explain better than I can. But it's a green caterpillar. To me, that just looks like it's made to be up on a grass leaf in the camouflage. And maybe I'll just point out real quickly, this is a picture that was taken on Christmas Eve in Wisconsin. They actually went out in a snow-free Christmas Eve, and they found a Poweshiek skipperling larva in diapause or hibernation on a prairie drop seed leaf. And so here's the known distribution of Poweshiek skipperling. If this isn't all of the records, it's probably 90% plus, I'm guessing. So you can see it overlaps quite a bit in this part of the Midwest with the Dakota skipper, but it also extended much farther east into eastern Michigan near Detroit and Flint. Jump forward to today, and all these populations seem to be gone. We've got one population in extreme southern Manitoba on the Nature Conservancy Canada property, maybe one on a preserve by Wisconsin, state of Wisconsin, there, and 4 sites in east central Michigan. And so it flew at the same time as Dakota, and a lot of time overlapped in the same habitats as Dakota in these areas, but it just seems like now, over the last 10, 15, 20 years, it's basically disappeared. And you saw the graph that showed the decline, the sharp decline in terms of the proportion of sites where we could find Poweshiek skipperling. And so, like I said, that's kind of the big issue here. We're still trying to figure out, and it's why we're here today, in large part, what happened there. And this just shows you that even these populations in Michigan, they're holding on in these prairie fen habitats in eastern Michigan, but some of these populations have disappeared recently. So we're taking a close look at that. And even these populations have gone down to pretty low numbers. So we're basically keeping this species in a way on life support, doing everything we can to try to keep this species going. And I just noticed this article several months ago in the Xerces Society newsletter called Wings. And this is something it struck me because this is something I've been hearing from people like Robert and Eric for quite a while now, that not only are these species that we've known, the Poweshiek skipperling, the Dakota skipper, dependent on high quality remnant prairies. They don't occur to any extent like in weedy roadsides or restored prairies or hay fields that are planted to non-native grasses. Dakota skipper, Poweshiek skipperling are really only in remnant native prairie that's usually of high quality. But then there's a whole other group of butterflies and some skippers that also might be present in those other kind of more anthropogenic habitats. But even these once common species now are also declining. And the one species that jumped out at me is this tawny edge skipper, or Palides themistocles. And this is a species that co-occurs like at Glacial Lake State Park, for example, but in a lot of places. It co-occurred with Dakota skipper. And it was for people who are just like me, bird people trying to learn butterflies. This was a species that was a challenge sometimes to distinguish for me from Dakota skipper. So flew at the same time, but much more common and widespread. But even species like this seem to be declining also. So I'll just briefly go through the causes of decline. And this was mentioned earlier, the habitat destruction. So we had this vast area of tallgrass prairie in the central United States and south central Canada. Over the last 150 years, of course, we've lost the vast majority of that. So historically, habitat destruction is very likely, caused a massive decline before we started, and habitat fragmentation before we started looking for and recording the locations of these species. But also, where grazing is too intense or frequent, we know that can lead to the extirpation of populations. Fire that's I put too intense, but I probably should have put too frequent. Fire that's too frequent or extensive, because the Dakota and the Poweshiek are probably a little bit different in their vulnerabilities to fire. Dakotas are down in those shelters, Poweshieks are above. But still, fire can kill both of these species when it's carried out. So if it's not carried out carefully, especially when you've got populations that have been isolated by habitat fragmentation, that can be a threat, and that can and probably has led to the extirpation of some populations. Herbicide use, and when I put this down, I was thinking mainly of the use of herbicides that are sprayed like in pastures to get rid of broadleaf plants. If you spray a native pasture where Dakota skippers occur, get rid of all the broadleaf plants, you don't have any nectar. And so that's another way that we've probably lost a fair number of populations. Secondary succession, and so really just, as most or all of you know, prairie is a type of habitat that needs some disturbance, needs fire, grazing, or haying, some type of periodic disturbance to prevent it from growing up to woody species or invasion by invasive species. And so that's definitely been a factor in some losses. So now we're kind of presented with this question. We know that pesticides are drifting into some of these habitats, and that's obviously a big question on our mind is pesticides, but also climate change. And we're constantly, hypothesizing about what might be going with some of these populations, what might be going on. And that's pretty much everything I have. I don't know if we have time for a few questions or not.
Questions?
Okay. I wanted to make sure Jessica did not stand up. Yeah, Crystal.
Any thoughts about diseases? Those could be a big factor for bumblebees, but I haven't heard about that for skippers. Do you know?
We've kicked it around quite a bit, but I don't know if Eric or Robert might have
We
anything.
have no idea what diseases may or may not be present that may be affecting skippers. There are generic diseases of some viruses that can have an effect, but I don't think we have any idea of any prevalence or if anything is new. Do you have any thought, Robert? Yeah, it's a shrug, maybe.
I mean, one of the issues that we talked about is whether some novel invasive pathogen has been introduced into this area, or some resident pathogen has become more virulent. But we don't have a corpse to do post-mortem on, so. Question over here. Change record.
It's probably the same situation. We don't really know. Probably because the caterpillars are so cryptic and they spend 11 months of their life as a caterpillar. We don't have a good understanding of their life history in a lot of ways, or some of their interactions. So additional predators, we don't know.
When you look at all of these possible factors, do any of them sort of make sense with the timing that we saw earlier, where starting about 2002 or something?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do any of these make sense in terms of the timing? I would say no, because, and this is something some people are saying, well, this is a latent result of too much fire on the landscape. But we lost Poweshiek from, habitats that were grazed, that were hayed, that were managed predominantly with fire, habitats that weren't managed very frequently. They seem to have disappeared from areas that were subject to a wide variety of management types. They disappeared from sites that were, fairly different in some ways in terms of their ecology and their, and so, to go back, I have to go through all those.
What about those sites in
Yeah.
Michigan? Are those less agricultural than some of these others? Like, could that be a potential signal to determine whether it's herbicide or pesticide application that might be influential?
Yeah, they seem like it. And that, we've lost one site recently in Michigan where it went from, I think one year there were 111 detected during surveys. It went down to 10 the next year, and then it was gone. And that site was much more, kind of embedded in kind of an agricultural matrix. And these others, there's definitely ag around them, and we're looking at ways to figure that out, but when you just look at it, it does seem like they're less embedded in kind of an agricultural matrix.
Just to follow up to that previous question about predators and pathogens, one question that I have, and maybe some of the folks in the room here know more about this, can shed some light, but the multicolor lady beetle, I don't know a whole lot about it. My impression is the larval stages of that are pretty aggressive predators, and exploited with the soybean aphid. That's something I'd like for the folks who know more about that to maybe address at some point during this discussion.
Yes.
Another big change to add to your list that I've noticed over the last 20 or 30 years or so is the pervasiveness of the European pasture grasses. Smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass is on every prairie now and is getting more and more dominant all the time. And as a result, you don't see near as many flowers in a lot of parks.
Yeah, and I'd be interested in what Robert would have to say about this, but it does seem like Kentucky bluegrass is just widespread and widely prevalent. And then brome, to me, it's more in the mezack areas, and that, like you go up areas where there's enough topography that you can see the difference in a fairly small area, like Glacial Lake State Park. I just recall seeing, you go down on the down slope where you've got, fairly high organic matter in the soils. It seems like you really get into areas with dense brome cover, and then you go up on the slope where it's drier and where a lot of times we've seen Dakota skipper, and it seems like there's much less brome. I don't know, Robert, I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
That's a common observation, and it seems to be strongly associated with grazing history as well, because the domestic cattle certainly prefer the more mezack habitat, those grasses, and those grasses are less tolerant of the grazing pressure than the drier species that prefer the drier habitats. So, like Glacial Lakes, that area was all pasture land for years and years. Parts are pretty well hammered, and so they're mostly grown in bluegrass. The drier part got less grazing pressure. There's a different suite of species and more tolerant grazing. Usually, native dominated. That's a very common phenomenon in our prairie areas.
Just want to make a quick comment. Jessica brought up the Michigan data, and if we're looking at that link between aphid management and the well-being of these skippers, when those skippers declined there, that was at a point when soybean aphid abundance and outbreaks in Michigan had kind of petered away. In the early 2000s, soybean aphid was a big issue throughout the region. But for some reason, kind of the eastern, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, the frequency and intensity of outbreaks had decreased along with that. Insecticide applications, and it's interesting that those populations kind of started decreasing after that. It looked like the x-axis, it looked like it was 10 or later when those populations started.
Yeah, let's see. Let's see, which direction was that? Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so like here, well, here's 11 here.
Remember, 2012 was just
Hot,
terrible.
yeah, very hot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of butterfly
Mhm.
populations survived
Mhm.
the climate parts of Indiana and Michigan in 2012. So that could be,
Mhm.
We'll have time for some synthesis questions at the end of the session too. But also at Sarah Warner's talk at the later in the morning, we'll touch on some of these factors of risk and assessments going on too. So.
great.
Okay.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much, Phil.